Good morning and welcome to the Point. This week, again in Lansing, there are talks about what to do about road funding. And while we don't have an answer yet, I did sit down with the Lieutenant Governor to get his take and also talk about his first 6 months on the job. Mr. Lieutenant Governor, it's been an interesting 6+ months now for you, and there's a lot we want to talk about. But as you and I were talking before we started this interview, it's the first time we really had a chance just to sit down and talk a little bit. So let me start with a question I love to ask newly elected folks to whatever position they're in. In your case, you enter the stage at a pretty high level as Lieutenant Governor. What has this 6 months been like for you? Because you've got a varied background, but nothing that is the same as holding elective office, statewide office.
That's right. So it's been a tremendous learning experience, being able to go to all parts of the state of Michigan, parts that I still hadn't had the pleasure of visiting yet, being able to connect with people, being able to show my family different parts of the state of Michigan. You know, growing up in Metro Detroit, there are places I never went. I didn't spend a lot of time. I actually had never visited Grand Rapids until 2017. And so being able to have my family come here multiple times, enjoy the Children's Museum, see the beautiful parks and the river and everything here in Grand Rapids is really fantastic. And I've been able to do that with my entire family across the state, and it's been really great. But also being able to build relationships with some of the people who are making some amazing things happen all across Michigan, whether those are community leaders, business leaders, and even some elected officials who I'm working with in the legislature who were really interested in moving Michigan forward. So it's a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to serve the entire state of Michigan as Lieutenant Governor.
What do you know about this office, this position, being in a statewide office today that you didn't know if we would have talked a year ago during the heat of the campaign? Because when I talk to new members of the legislature, they oftentimes describe it as drinking from a fire hose. It's a pretty steep curve. As Lieutenant Governor, I think there was probably a lot you had to get up to speed on, right?
Well, sure. I mean, I spent a lot of time during the transition, for example, preparing to be able to be the president of the Senate. And so really digging in on the Senate rules and procedures and making sure that I could serve in that constitutional capacity in a way and really respect how important it is. So I think one thing I may have underestimated is just how much time I would need to spend in Lansing to preside. I'm really aggressive. I like to go everywhere. I want to be in front of as many people as possible. I want to be listening to as many people as possible in person, but have had to spend a lot of time in Lansing. But that's okay, because this is where we were making the important choices for the state of Michigan.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people fail to realize that as Lieutenant Governor, that is one of your primary responsibilities. And that becomes particularly important in a time when you and the governor have an agenda that you would like to shepherd through a legislature that's dominated by the party that is not Democrats.
Yes.
The Republicans
Yes.
control the House and the Senate. So how has it worked in terms of making relations in the Senate? You've spent a lot of time with the senators, and obviously the Republicans are in charge, and if you and Governor Whitmer are to get some of those things done, you've got to build relationships with some of those. How's that gone?
Right, it's been great actually. So I made it a priority to make sure that I spent time both in Lansing and in district with as many senators as possible. I've had one-on-one meetings with all 38 senators, and we actually accomplished that before the end of March. And I've also been able to spend time in district with a number of them as well, because I think you can't really work together until you have established that trust, that relationship building. And so while we may disagree on the path thus far, and to be clear, like, Republicans need to put forward a path on how to have new road funding and how to have infrastructure spending, but there are things that we can work together on. So one of the issues I care very deeply about, for example, is making sure everyone in Michigan has access to high-speed internet. That is something that Republicans and Democrats alike seem to agree with. That's something that especially our rural Republican senators and state representatives in different parts of the country, especially in northern Michigan, really want to understand how to solve that problem for their communities. So these are the kinds of things we can work together on, but we first have to have those relationships built, have that communication established so that we can talk about those real issues.
I want to give you an observation from the outside looking in, and then you can tell me, if you choose to, whether I'm on track or off track. I was surprised. I was a skeptic about auto no-fault insurance because I have covered the legislature for a lot of years and I've seen a lot of incarnations and a lot of tries. And I was particularly surprised that it came up as quickly as it did, because the conversation just the week before did not sound very much like a deal was afoot.
Sure.
But it came together and was signed on Mackinac Island. My observation was on Mackinac Island for the Detroit Regional Chamber event was that the relationship between the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House and the Governor and you and a number of other leadership had actually developed into what looked to be a cordial, amicable relationship, not just different factions who have to work with each other, but people who appeared to enjoy working with each other. Was that just something I was reading into it, or has that basis been established?
Well, we certainly were happy about coming to a solution on car insurance, something that's plagued the state for the last 40 years, which, I don't know how long you've been covering the legislature, but that's longer than I've been alive. Now, that being said, we have established mutual respect and trust, and that's really a credit to Governor Whitmer. As someone who has had such deep experience in the legislature and with negotiating, she knew how important it was to make sure everyone was coming to the table. And that's why we reestablished the quadrant meetings every other week, which is something that was actually started by Governor Engler to ensure that we were having that communication to build that rapport. So I think that's a foundation upon which we are going to work going forward. But we need to work harder. We need to see more now from our Republican colleagues as we're going into the now really crunch time on the budget. We're past June 30th. We're past the time when school districts around the state of Michigan need to understand what their budgets are going to look like going into the next school year. We're past that time for some municipalities and counties. And so we want to now build on that foundation that we saw on car insurance, build on that rapport that we've been building since January to get something done in the budget for the people of Michigan.
I was with the governor last week in Ottawa County over at a bridge that is closed down because the bridge is too sufficiently damaged to be used, and the folks that are in charge of that particular bridge don't have the funds to fix it.
Right.
And that, I believe, is one of 62 bridges around the state that the governor said are closed.
Yes.
The legislature, we know, has been talking mostly to each other. The Senate and the House still haven't agreed upon exactly where they want to go. And as you point out, we've got the end of September as a date for the budget that it has to be done.
Yes.
Lawmakers are not coming back to Lansing, and I don't know when they are. I asked the governor that question. She said she thought maybe in August. I talked to some lawmakers earlier this week that said maybe not. So
we'll be ready for them when they get back.
Yeah, but it really does get to be a short period of time. If they don't get back even until the last part of August, you may only have between 15 and 21 session days to get budget finished up, and there's still quite a bit to do. Are you concerned about that?
Well, the truth is we've had 42 working days in the Senate thus far where we could have already gotten something done. So, my concern is really with just what it means to not have a budget passed, what it means for school districts, what it means for municipalities who are dependent upon that revenue sharing for their fire departments, what it means to not understand how much money we'll have to invest in clean water and clean drinking water infrastructure and the research into PFAS contamination. So I am always optimistic. I believe the Republicans are trying to figure out a solution. The truth is, though, that we put forward a solution to solve the budgetary problems in the state of Michigan. We put forward the plan in March, on March 5th. That was more than 130 days ago. We are ready and willing to come to the table like we did with car insurance, like we'll do with any other issue. Republicans need to come to the table. They've been talking amongst themselves. They've had enough time to come up with an idea. We have an idea that works, and it's time for them to get behind it.
The question will be then, is there a landing spot? Because the plan that you and the governor proposed when the budget proposal was laid out was $2.5 billion.
Yes.
It was a gas sales tax. Republicans declared it everything from, a non-starter or whatever. But as you point out, they haven't come up with a unified plan on their own, but if they do, it seems likely, again as an observer, that it might not hit that $2.5 billion mark. Is there somewhere in between, or is that the money?
We can't negotiate with ourselves. So no plan is a non-starter, and they don't have the plan. So that's what I consider to be a non-starter, not a concrete proposal like the one we put on the table. So, when they are coming with a proposal that's real, that is not, a garage sale in Michigan that includes selling bridges, when it's not, trying to gut or eliminate teacher pensions and put the state in a fiscally irresponsible position should there be a recession to come. When they come with a real solution that's going to potentially work, then we have something to talk about. But right now we don't, and it's hard to negotiate when people have not come to the table.
You've talked about some important issues, things that you obviously would like to see accomplished beyond the broadband and talking about roads and obviously doing some of the things that we've talked about. What is a real priority for you? I know you're very early. I said before we started, this will be kind of like your entrance interview, and you quickly admonished me that you weren't doing an exit interview anytime soon. So it's early. But what is the thing or a thing that you could do during your time as lieutenant governor that you would say, yeah,
So something I'm really excited about is reforming our system of criminal justice. So I have the honor to be co-chairing a task force on pretrial incarceration with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And we're taking the biggest deep dive into the county jail system in the history of the state of Michigan. And actually, our first task force meeting is coming up this coming Wednesday, so tomorrow in Detroit. We're going to be back in September in Grand Rapids for our second task force meeting. And we're looking at why people are in county jail, for how long, how did they get there, what services are they getting, what services do they need. And from this will emerge a series of recommendations about how to improve that system at the state and at the county level. It's in partnership with the Pew Charitable Trust, who's come to the table with $1 million in resources and technical support for us to do this real deep dive and change the system of criminal justice and jail in the state of Michigan. We also are doing some work in the Department of Corrections in that same regard. 145 people come home from prison in Michigan every week. We have to think about what reentry means in all the communities those people are returning home to. So I'm excited about that batch of work. And another thing I'm really excited about too is how we can improve the quality of life in cities. I am a Detroiter. To my knowledge, there has not been a Detroiter, a person from the biggest city in the state of Michigan, in the office of Lieutenant Governor. And so I want to work to make sure that we are putting forth an agenda that will improve the quality of life in cities, for kids in cities, making sure we have available and affordable housing, making sure that we have environmental quality and justice in our cities, and just making sure that we are doing everything we need so that people can thrive. So I'll be having a robust agenda setting process going around the state to some of the biggest cities, but also communities of interest that have interesting and unique populations to make sure that we have a city's agenda that's responsive to Michiganders' needs.
While the governor and lieutenant governor have their ideas about what to do about roads, so do the Republicans, who are in the majority in the House and Senate. Coming up, we'll talk with one Republican member of the House who says roads can be fixed with no new taxes. Welcome back to the Point. We're talking about roads again, as we have for so many weeks, but that will be the big issue in getting a budget passed. Remember, that budget has to be done by the end of September. Representative Stephen Johnson gives us his take. Representative, let's start by talking about what the issue in Lansing is right now, and that's how to come up with a mechanism, if one can be arrived at, to do something about increasing road funding or infrastructure funding. We know that the governor has asked for a 45-cent per gallon tax increase, gas tax increase. Many people say that that is a non-starter, particularly over in the House where you serve. I know that the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House, as well as all of those relevant committees, have been talking about this, but so far there hasn't been a plan that's come forward, not a unified plan anyway. Where, from your perspective, are we? First of all, do we need to come up with more money for roads and bridges and such? And second of all, do we know what that dollar figure is? And if we know those two things, where's it going to come from?
Yeah, so there is a plan. The House, we voted out our budget back in June now, and it increased the MDOT budget to $5.4 billion. And just to put that in perspective, I think back in 2012, somewhere around there, we were spending about $2.5 billion. So we're more than double in the last 10 years what we spent. We did that without raising taxes. The governor's plan is about $5.7 billion, so it's a little bit higher, but that's a 45-cent gas tax hike. So I think we clearly have a pretty good plan. And her plan isn't that well received, obviously within the Republican caucus, but even in the Democrat caucus, none of them have actually offered that legislation. So what you're seeing is a Republican plan that offers record spending for roads without raising taxes.
Where does that money come from? Obviously, you only have out of a $60 billion budget, you got about $10 billion that you really get to work with. So where does the extra money come from?
Because the economy is booming right now, you're seeing the revenue that we come in with taxes is growing every year. The state budget is growing every year just because how well the economy is doing. And that's a good thing. So you have that, and then we made cuts to areas. We said, hey, we need to prioritize. Before going to the people in Michigan and taking their money, is there some cuts we can do within the budget? And so we made some cuts to administrative lines. We've got some other programs in there. That's how you should do it. Instead of going to the people and asking them for money, what can we do first to cut our budgets first?
Specifically, what would you cut?
I think a number of things could be cut. I look at the MEDC, which is this corporate welfare program where we give all kinds of money to certain select businesses. So you're telling me we should be giving handouts to certain people and taking money from Michigan drivers? Well, let's stop those handouts. before we go to the Michigan drivers. There's a lot of issues out there. There's a lot of those pork projects that you see. All the lobbyists, they all support tax hikes. Why? Because they know they're going to take that money, and you and I both know, if we raise the gas tax 45 cents, it's not all going to the roads. Special interests are going to get their hands on that money. We need to stop doing that, stop funding those special projects, put that money to where it belongs, into roads and schools, into the most important function of state government.
What is the dollar figure, if you know? The last governor put it at $1.2 billion, and this governor puts it at $2.5 billion. And I saw a report that I can't credit now because I forget where it came from, but it was something suggesting that the need for roads and infrastructure in the state was something like $3.2 billion in addition to what is currently being spent. I mean, is there a reliable number? Do we know how much money it really takes ongoing?
The problem is a lot of these studies are funded by those within the road construction industry, and they are clearly incentivized to take as much money as possible. The problem is, let's just say we had $2 billion extra laying around. The problem with throwing that at roads right now is the construction industry is tapped out. There's no more workers. So you could throw $2 billion at roads, and all you're going to get is massive inflation. You're not going to get any more roads built. If you've been driving anywhere in Michigan this summer, you're seeing construction everywhere. There's really not much more we could do. I know that's not an easy answer to people. They want their roads fixed, but you're limited. We just don't have the workers. You look at the price of aggregate, it's through the roof. It is very expensive right now to build roads. What I would advocate, we are still paying down debt from the Engler administration and the Granholm administration, where they bonded to pay for roads. Those roads have already been replaced, and we're still paying the debt on that. I would advocate, let's pay that debt off now. Get rid of that. And in the future, as the economy tightens down, which it will, and now the labor market won't be as tight, then you'll have more money freed up to go ahead and put that into the roads. That's a long-term solution. It doesn't get things fixed this year, but it makes sense fiscally.
I was in a hearing, a House hearing, Representative O'Malley, I believe, was holding, talking about just the process of fixing roads. And some of the experts he had, and some of them were from the industry, and some of them were from MDOT, and some of them were engineers, et cetera, said that about 10% is kind of where you max out on the number of roads you can work at once within the state without creating gridlock and all kinds of transportation problems. I mean, right now, there's a big, very inconvenient detour around Lansing because of road work that's being done there. So there are some other limitations, not just time and money and people to do it, but there is a certain infrastructure roadblock, if you will, after a certain percentage of roads are under construction at once, or at least that's what came up in that committee. I found that interesting because even if you had all the people, it's not practical to try to fix everything at once, obviously.
Right. Oh, I mean, you try to drive downtown Grand Rapids, right? 196 is being a mess right now. That's where I would say, instead of just trying to focus on construction everywhere, can we focus on making sure that when we build a road, it's built well and it's going to last a long time? You look at M6 and what the fiasco there was. They had to rip it up and redo it after not that long. That's, I think, where we need to start looking at. Are there different materials we can use? Are there different things we can try so the roads will last longer so we don't have to come in here every year and redo it? And I think people are willing to pay a little bit more if it's going to last longer, so that way you don't have construction season nonstop.
I want to go back to something you said earlier because you're accurate. The House did pass out a plan that increases road funding. But what I said earlier was that plan has not been agreed to by the Senate. I mean, the Senate's working on their own. So the negotiation seems to be between the House and the Senate, the majority in the House and the Senate, to come up with something that they can then go to the governor and talk with her about, because you've got this three-legged stool that's going to take to get this passed. And right now, at least publicly, we haven't seen what that negotiation looks like, though we know they're talking. Do you get a sense, I mean, I know we talked earlier that you're all kind of on standby and ready to go back when and or if something comes together, but do you get a sense that there has been progress made over the summer, or is this just kind of an ongoing conversation?
I know there's been progress with the House and Senate, the leadership there. They're talking. Obviously, there hasn't been a plan introduced yet, but as we saw with no-fault auto insurance, people talked and we got some big stuff done. So I think it can happen here. The issue is the House right now, we are very adamant, no more taxes. I mean, they just raised taxes on, 2015? We don't need to raise taxes again. The governor is very adamant to raise taxes, and the Senate is kind of somewhere in between. So that's where we're trying to negotiate and make sure that whatever plan we come up with, it's not going to raise taxes.
Earlier in this show, the lieutenant governor, when I spoke with him, and I said, is there a landing spot someplace between 2.5 billion and whatever the other side comes up with? And he said, we can't negotiate with ourselves. And so he and the governor both said, that they want people to get back and talk, but surely talks have been happening between the leadership and administration, but this will be the linchpin to finally get a budget done, won't it?
Yeah, and as far as negotiating with themselves, they offered a 45-cent gas tax, which no one supported. Even Democrats within the legislature, none of them introduced that plan. We've actually voted out a plan that put record high spending into roads. We passed out of the House. If we had to, we could probably get it through the Senate. The Senate has a similar plan without raising taxes. The governor has not come back to us with a counter proposal. I think that's part of the deal too. When you're going to go out there and say, hey, 45-cent gas tax hike, and clearly that's a non-starter, we offer, a very responsible plan. I think it's incumbent on her to now offer a counter, and we haven't seen that publicly yet.
All right, let's move on for a little bit. I was looking through some of the things that you had made as priorities for this session, and you had a very clear statement about wanting to look at due process, civil liberties, civil rights, kind of the justice process in general. And there has been some progress made there, some of the things that you were looking out for. Talk to me about your interest in that, what you think the state ought to be doing when it comes to just the general treatment of people as they end up with some type of a legal issue or problem.
Yeah, so one of the big things that we tackled early on is civil asset forfeiture. The idea where essentially the government can take your property without actually charging you with a crime. And obviously that's very problematic. And so we worked on legislation and say, hey, if let's say you're a drug dealer, you're a drug trafficker, you get pulled over, you got tons of cash in your vehicle, the government can confiscate that cash, but they have to convict you of a crime. They have to say, hey, you are clearly dealing drugs here, then you have your day in court. Prior to this, before we passed that legislation, they could essentially just say that's what you're doing without actually convicting you, and you're innocent until proven guilty. And so that's what we worked on, trying to respect your property rights. Say, in order for the government to take your property, there must be a conviction first.
The idea that property was taken, people were charged and then not found guilty, and then their property wasn't being returned. I mean,
some of them were never even charged.
Okay, and so now that has that was one of the early on things that you did. Are there other pieces of legislation that you want to do that deals with some of these issues?
So that was the first bill, 4001. It didn't fix the entire problem. I think there's still work to be done in that area, but it got us to a good starting point. I don't know if there's going to be an appetite to do any more this legislative session, but it's obviously something that I'm still interested in.
And when you think about, that was a bipartisan bill.
Absolutely, yes.
And when you think about auto no-fault insurance that you mentioned earlier, that came together in a bipartisan fashion.
It took a while, but eventually it did, yes.
So are we seeing a spirit in divided government of more cooperation than perhaps we have, that you saw in your first term?
Well, we have to. I mean, you have a Democrat administration. We haven't had that in 8 years, so we're essentially forced to. It would be nice if there was a Republican governor. It'd be a lot easier to get some things done, but this is the hand we're dealt with, and I think we've done a decent job of making it work. We haven't got the budget done yet, and that's obviously big. If we can somehow get that done without raising taxes, then I think we've done a very good job.
Road funding and how to pay for it. That will be the big sticking point when it comes to getting a budget passed. Remember, that budget has to be done by the end of September, so the clock is ticking and we'll continue to watch. Be back with a final note next, To the Point. The big news next week will be all about that nationally televised Democratic debate. We'll be in Detroit to cover it and talk about it next week. To the Point.